In a world carved from dust and desperation, a heartbroken rancher's solitary life takes an unimaginable turn, leading to a family he never expected. But how does a single act of defiance at a cruel auction rewrite two destinies? Where are you watching this story unfold from today? Let us know in the comments, and subscribe for more tales of the Untamed West. The dust of the Montana road was a familiar ghost, clinging to Thomas's worn leather chaps and settling in the deep lines etched around his eyes. For 12 years, since the great blizzard had stolen his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Caleb, the world had felt muted, its colors bleached by grief. His ranch, nestled in a lonely valley, was a kingdom of silence, populated only by the lowing of cattle and the whispering of wind through pines, a constant mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in his chest. He came to town only when necessity clawed at him, for salt, flour, and the bitter taste of other people's lives. Today, however, was different. The town buzzed with a cruel energy, a spectacle he'd intended to ignore, a chattel auction, remnants of a ewe. Cavalry raid on a Crow camp were being sold off, horses, tools, and, he'd heard with a sickening lurch in his gut, a woman. He stood at the back of the crowd, his broad shoulders a bulwark against the press of bodies, his face a mask of grim indifference. He'd only meant to witness, to bear silent testimony to the world's casual cruelty. The auctioneer, a man with a florid face and a voice slick with greed, barked out prices for stolen blankets and beadwork. Then, they brought her out. She wasn't dragged. She walked with a stillness that defied the rusted manacles on her wrists. Her black hair was a river down her back, her face a sculpture of proud angles and deep-set eyes that saw everything and betrayed nothing. The crowd fell into a hushed, leering anticipation. The auctioneer called her the Crow Woman, stripping her of name and history. He spoke of her as if she were a broodmare, listing her supposed strengths, her youth, her potential for hard labor. Men laughed, their eyes crawling over her with a possessive hunger that made Thomas's hand clench into a fist. He saw the glint in the eyes of Jedediah Kane, a pig farmer known for his heavy hands and brutish nature. He saw others, men whose souls were as barren as the alkali flats south of town. They weren't bidding for a housekeeper. They were bidding for a thing to be used and broken, a cold, clear rage, an emotion Thomas hadn't felt in over a decade, cut through the fog of his sorrow. It was the same protective instinct that had roared to life when a wolf had threatened his herd, the same fierce love that had fueled his desperate, hopeless search in the blizzard for Sarah and Caleb. He looked at the woman on the block. He saw not a savage, as the auctioneer proclaimed, but a person enduring the unendurable with a courage that shamed every man there. Her name, he would later learn, was Dawn Song. But in that moment, she was the last flicker of defiance in a world gone mad. The bidding started low, a grim game for the town's vultures. Jedediah Kane was leading, his bids punctuated by smug, possessive grins. The price climbed. $20. $30. Thomas thought of the money sewn into the lining of his coat, his entire savings, the buffer against another bad winter, the sum of 2 years of relentless, back-breaking work. It was his security, his anchor in a lonely world. Kane bid $45, a sneer on his face, daring anyone to challenge him. The auctioneer's hammer hovered, going once, going twice. In the suffocating silence, a voice, rough from disuse but clear as a struck bell, rang out. $50. Every head turned. Thomas stood taller, his gaze locked not with the auctioneer, but with the woman. A flicker of something, surprise, disbelief, crossed her stoic features before it was gone. Kane, face purpling with rage, roared back. $60. The crowd gasped. It was a fortune. Thomas didn't hesitate. $100. A collective shock rippled through the onlookers. It was an insane amount, the price of a prime bull, of a small plot of land. It was the price of his solitude, his safety net. Kane stared, his mouth agape, the numbers finally exceeding his own cruel means. The auctioneer, stunned but greedy, slammed his hammer down. Sold to the quiet man in the back. The transaction was a blur of cold metal and signed paper. He handed over the worn bills, the weight of them leaving his hand, feeling like a physical part of him was being torn away. He walked to the platform, ignoring the whispers and stares. He didn't look at the auctioneer. He looked at Dawn Song. He took the key, his large, calloused fingers fumbling with the lock on her manacles. They sprang open, falling to the dusty platform with a heavy clink. For a long moment, they stood there. He didn't touch her. He just nodded toward the street. "Ma'am." It was all he said. He had not bought a slave. He had bought her freedom, and in doing so, had shackled himself to a future he could not possibly imagine. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent procession of two strangers bound by a transaction neither fully understood. Thomas rode his steady gelding, while Dawn Song sat astride the tired mare he'd purchased for her, her posture ramrod straight, her eyes fixed on the distant, jagged line of the mountains. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick with unspoken questions, with the ghosts of the auction, with the weight of 12 years of solitude and a lifetime of stolen freedom. The cold, cruel eyes of Jedediah Kane and the other bidders felt like they were still boring into his back. Thomas felt the hollowness of his pockets, the $100 void that now represented his entire worldly wealth. But it was a clean, sharp emptiness, not the dull, chronic ache of grief he was used to. When they reached the turnoff to his property, the landscape softened, the harsh plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine and cottonwood. The ranch house sat low and sturdy, built of hand-hewn logs, smoke curling from its stone chimney like a lonely breath. He dismounted and gestured toward the house. "This is it." He led the horses to the trough, his movements economical and practiced. Dawn Song slid from her horse, her feet landing on the earth with a quiet finality. She didn't look at him, but at the house, the barn, the vast, empty sky. He saw her take it all in, her expression unreadable. He felt a sudden, clumsy need to explain. "There's 2 bedrooms. The one upstairs was my boy's. The other is downstairs. You can have it. The door has a lock." He paused, the words feeling heavy and inadequate. "You are not a prisoner here. When your strength is back, you are free to go. The next town is 2 days' ride north, or you can return to your people, if you know the way." He was offering her a choice, a thing he suspected she hadn't had in a long, long time. She finally looked at him, her gaze direct and piercing, searching for the lie in his words. She found none, only a deep, settled weariness. She gave a single, sharp nod. The first few days were a dance of silent accommodation. Thomas went about his chores, mending fences, tending the cattle, chopping wood, the familiar rhythm a comfort. He left food on the kitchen table, fresh bread, a slab of salted pork, coffee. He'd return to find the food gone and the plate washed and set neatly aside. He rarely saw her. He'd catch a glimpse of her figure by the window, a shadow moving through the house. But she was as quiet as a deer, leaving no trace but for the subtle signs of her presence. The house, once a tomb of his memories, began to feel different. It felt occupied. A week passed. One afternoon, returning from the far pasture, he saw her not in the house, but kneeling in the overgrown patch of earth beside it. It had been Sarah's garden, after she died. Thomas couldn't bear to look at it, letting it be reclaimed by wild thistle and stubborn weeds. Dawnsong was working with a focus that was both fierce and gentle. She wasn't just pulling weeds, she was examining them, her fingers tracing the leaves, her head tilted as if listening to a secret. With a sharpened stick, she carefully uprooted some plants, setting them aside, while others she cleared away with decisive movements. Thomas stood by the fence, watching, the handle of his axe forgotten in his hand. He recognized sagebrush and common yarrow, but she was finding things he'd never noticed, her hands moving with an inherited certainty. She wasn't destroying the wildness, she was curating it, tending to it. Over the next few days, the chaotic patch of earth began to take shape. It became a garden again, but not the one Sarah had planted with orderly rows of beans and corn. This was something else, a living library of native plants, each one seeming to have its own purpose. She used a flat stone to grind some leaves, mixing them with water to create a poultice, which she applied to a deep gash on her mare's leg. One evening, he came in from the barn, chilled to the bone, to find a steaming mug on the table. It wasn't coffee. The aroma was earthy and sharp, with a hint of mint. He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. She was standing by the hearth, her silhouette softened by the firelight. "For the cold," she said. Her voice was low, the first word she had volunteered in over a week. He took a sip. The liquid was warm and potent, a wave of heat that spread through his chest and eased the ache in his joints. It tasted of the earth, of the mountains, of her quiet, powerful knowledge. He drank the whole mug, the silence between them no longer tense, but companionable. In that moment, a silent pact was sealed. She would heal the wounded land, and in doing so, she would begin to heal the wounded man who had offered her a sanctuary. He had given her a key to her manacles. She was now offering him a key to a different kind of prison, the one he had built around his own heart. The fragile piece of their shared solitude was a thin layer of new snow over old, hard ground. The past was never far. It lived in the empty chair at the dinner table, in the small, worn-out boots Thomas kept in a chest at the foot of his bed. He hadn't opened that chest in a decade. But one afternoon, while searching for a spare leather strap, his hand brushed against the cold, iron latch. An impulse, sharp and painful, made him lift the lid. The scent of cedar and old wool filled the air. There, nestled amongst Sarah's shawls, was Caleb's greatest treasure, a small wooden horse, crudely carved but worn smooth by a child's loving hands. Thomas had carved it for him for his 5th birthday. He picked it up, the weight of it both insignificant and immense. He could almost feel the phantom grip of his son's small fingers wrapped around his own, could hear the ghost of his laughter as he'd galloped the toy across the cabin floor. The grief, a beast he usually kept chained in the deepest part of him, broke free. It was a physical force, doubling him over, a dry, ragged sob tearing from his throat. He didn't know how long he sat there, on the floor by the chest, the wooden horse clutched in his hand, drowning in the silence of what was lost. He was unaware of anything but the crushing weight of memory, until a shadow fell over him. Dawnsong stood in the doorway, her presence as quiet as the dust motes dancing in the shaft of afternoon light. She didn't speak. Her eyes went from his contorted face to the small wooden horse in his hand. Her own face, usually a mask of stoic control, softened with a flicker of profound, empathetic pain. She walked over and knelt, not beside him, but a respectful distance away, her gaze fixed on the toy. He was a gift, Thomas rasped, the words scraping his throat. My son, Caleb, the blizzard, 12 years ago. It was more than he'd said about them to any living soul. Dawn Song remained silent for a long moment, her dark eyes holding his. Then she spoke, her voice low and even, yet carrying the weight of a storm. "I had a daughter," she said, her gaze drifting to the window, to the unyielding mountains beyond. "Her name was Little Fawn. She had a doll made of deer skin, with hair from a black horse's tail." She paused, and in that pause, Thomas heard the echo of his own loss. The men with blue coats and yellow stripes on their legs came at dawn. It was not a battle. It was a slaughter. Her voice didn't tremble, but a terrible stillness came over her, the stillness of a frozen river. "They burned our lodges. They took our horses. My husband, Stone Bear, tried to fight. He died with a saber in his chest." She looked back at Thomas, and for the first time, he saw past the resilient survivor to the grieving woman beneath. "I held Little Fawn. I ran. But they were on horseback. One of them." He laughed as he took her from my arms. He tossed her doll into the fire. The story fell into the quiet room, not as a plea for pity, but as a statement of fact, as stark and brutal as a winter-stripped tree. The horror of the raid, the unimaginable cruelty of having her child ripped from her arms, settled over Thomas. His own grief, as vast and lonely as he'd always believed it to be, suddenly had a companion. It was a different kind of loss, one stolen by storm, the other by man, but the hollowness they left behind was the same. The wooden horse in his hand felt connected, somehow, to the ghost of a deerskin doll. He finally understood the deep, unyielding strength in her. It was the strength of one who has lost everything, and yet continues to breathe, to walk, to work the earth. He slowly placed the wooden horse back in the chest, the gesture feeling less like an ending and more like an acknowledgement. He looked at Dawn Song, truly seeing the shared landscape of their sorrow. "I'm sorry," he said, the words hopelessly inadequate, but offered with the full weight of his heart. She simply nodded, a shared, unspoken understanding passing between them. They were two survivors from two different worlds, their families destroyed by different kinds of savagery, now bound together not just by a $100 transaction, but by the sacred, terrible language of loss. The first flakes began to fall just after dusk, soft and deceptively gentle. But Thomas knew the signs. The sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The wind had dropped to an unnerving whisper, and the cattle were huddled together, their backs to the north. A preternatural stillness had settled over the valley, the kind that precedes a violent outburst. "A storm is coming," he said, his voice grim as he barred the heavy barn door. "A bad one." He looked at Dawn Song, who was gazing out the cabin window, her hand resting on the cool glass. The memory of the wooden horse and her story of the raid lingered between them, a fresh wound. She didn't need him to explain the danger. She could read it in the sky, could feel it in the sudden drop in the air's pressure. She nodded, her expression somber. "The White Fury," she murmured, a Crow term for a blizzard that kills. The word sent a spear of ice through Thomas's heart. The White Fury. It was the perfect name for the monstrous storm that had claimed Sarah and Caleb. For 12 years, he had feared this. Another blizzard that was not just a storm, but a reckoning. An echo of the past come to life. He worked with a feverish intensity, banking the fire, checking the seal on the windows, hauling in enough wood to last for days. Each gust of wind that rattled the log walls sounded like a ghostly whisper of Sarah's name. Dawn Song moved with a quiet efficiency of her own, filling every spare bucket and pot with water from the pump before it could freeze. She checked the stores of dried herbs in her garden, now covered by a thin blanket of snow, gathering a few last bundles. They worked in tandem, their movements weaving around each other in the small cabin space, a shared purpose overriding the need for words. By midnight, the gentle snowfall had become a raging, horizontal torrent. The wind howled like a starved wolf, a physical force that seemed intent on tearing the cabin apart. The world outside the windows vanished into a swirling vortex of white. They were trapped, an island in a sea of frozen chaos. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Despite the roaring fire, a bitter cold seeped through the chinks in the logs. Thomas found Dawn Song shivering, her blanket wrapped tightly around her, her face pale in the flickering firelight. The memory of finding Sarah, her body stiff and blue in a snowdrift, hit him with the force of a physical blow. He would not let it happen again. "Here," he said, his voice rough. He took the thickest buffalo hide from his own bed and draped it over her shoulders. "Stay by the fire." He sat on the other side of the hearth, the shotgun across his lap, keeping a sleepless vigil. He wasn't just fighting the cold, he was fighting the ghosts that danced in the storm. For 2 days, the blizzard raged without end. Time blurred into a cycle of feeding the fire, melting snow for water, and listening to the relentless assault of the wind. The small cabin, once a symbol of his isolation, became their shared shelter, a crucible testing their fragile trust. In the forced proximity, the silence began to give way to small things. He watched her mend a tear in his shirt with a neat, practiced stitch. She watched him methodically clean his rifle, his hands sure and steady. On the second night, the fire low, the wind sounding a particularly mournful cry, she began to hum. It was a low, sad tune, a song without words that spoke of loss and resilience. Thomas listened, the melody weaving into the howl of the storm, somehow robbing it of its menace. It wasn't a lament. It was a song of survival. "My grandmother sang that when the winter was long," she said softly into the quiet. "She said it reminded the spirits that we were still here." Thomas looked into the flames, the wooden horse from his son's chest a vivid image in his mind. "Caleb loved the snow," he said, the confession surprising him. He wasn't afraid of it, not like I am now. It was an admission of a vulnerability he had never shown another soul. He was the strong, silent rancher, the man who had survived everything. But he was afraid. He was terrified. Dawn Song looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fire's glow. She didn't offer empty platitudes or reassurances. She simply said, "Fear keeps us alive. It tells us to build a stronger fire." In that moment, something shifted. He wasn't just the man who had saved her, and she wasn't just the woman he was sheltering. They were two people, sharing a fire, pushing back against the same darkness, both the one outside and the ones within. When the storm finally broke on the third morning, the silence it left behind was profound. The world was a blanket of pristine, blinding white. The cabin was intact. They had survived, and in the shared shelter, facing the ghost of the white fury together, they had laid the foundation for something stronger than mere survival. The end of the blizzard was not an end to their trials. It was a beginning. The valley was buried, and the path to town was a treacherous landscape of massive snowdrifts and hidden ice. They were isolated, but for the first time, it didn't feel like loneliness. The shared ordeal of the storm had forged a new dynamic between them, a quiet partnership born of mutual respect. But the outside world, with its long memory and short-sighted prejudice, was bound to intrude. It happened 2 weeks later, when the trail finally became passable. Thomas needed supplies, and the silence from the surrounding homesteads was unsettling. He rode into town and found an atmosphere thick with fear. It wasn't the blizzard people were talking about anymore. It was a sickness, a cough that settled deep in the lungs, A fever that wouldn't break. Old Man Hemlock, a trapper from the high country, was dead. The blacksmith's youngest daughter was fading fast. Whispers followed Thomas as he moved through the general store. They weren't just the usual whispers about the quiet rancher. They were laced with something new, something ugly. He saw Jedediah Kane, the pig farmer from the auction, holding court with a few other men near the stove. Kane's eyes, small and mean, lit up with malice when he saw Thomas. "Well, look what the blizzard dragged in," Kane sneered, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Come down from that nest of yours? Heard you're keeping that savage as a pet." Thomas's jaw tightened. He ignored him, placing his order with the storekeeper, whose face was pale and strained. "Flour, coffee, beans," Thomas said, his voice low and steady. As he waited, Kane ambled over, his cronies flanking him. "The sickness started after the storm," Kane said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. "Right after this valley got cursed. Some say bringing a heathen squaw into a God-fearing land brings pestilence, bad medicine." The words hung in the air, ripe with poison. People stopped their conversations, their eyes darting between the two men. They were scared, and scared people needed someone to blame. The Crow woman, the mysterious outsider living with the reclusive rancher, was an easy target. Thomas turned slowly, his calm a stark contrast to Kane's bloated aggression. He looked Kane dead in the eye. "The woman on my ranch has a name," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the cold authority of a man who means every word. "It's Dawn Song, and she's not the cause of any sickness. She's a healer." A scoffing laugh came from one of Kane's men. "A healer? A witch, you mean? Probably put a curse on us all for what the cavalry did." Thomas took a step forward, his shadow falling over Kane. He was a head taller and carried the solid strength of a man who worked from sunup to sundown. "The only curse in this valley, Jedediah," Thomas said, his voice dropping even lower, "is the ignorance and hatred you peddle. The woman you tried to buy for your own foul purposes has more honor in her little finger than you have in your whole body." He was no longer just the man who had performed a private act of kindness. He was now making a public stand, drawing a line in the dust of the store floor. He was defending not just Dawn Song, but their sanctuary, the fragile peace they had built. Kane, emboldened by his audience and his own bigotry, puffed out his chest. "You'd best watch your mouth. Thomas, defending her. It's like you're one of them now." The storekeeper nervously pushed Thomas's supplies across the counter. "That'll be all. Thomas, best you be on your way." It was a dismissal, a plea to avoid further conflict. Thomas paid his bill, his gaze never leaving Kane. He hoisted the heavy sack of flour onto his shoulder as if it were nothing. "If anyone comes near my ranch with malice in their heart," he said to the entire room, "they'll be dealing with me." He turned and walked out, the silence he left behind more powerful than any shout. As he rode away, he knew the confrontation was far from over. He had drawn their fire. He had publicly declared his allegiance. Now, their home was not just a shelter from the storms of nature, but a fortress against the hatred of men. The sickness spread like a fire in dry grass. It moved from the blacksmith's house to the stable, then to the homesteads dotting the valley. The town doctor, a young man from the east named Alistair Finch with more confidence than experience, rode himself ragged. He prescribed laudanum for the cough and bled his patients according to the latest medical journals. But the fever persisted, and the rattling in people's chests only grew worse. More lights went out in the small windows of the town. The fear and suspicion Thomas had faced in the general store curdled into open hostility. Jedediah Kane's poison had found fertile ground. The Crow woman was to blame. Her bad medicine was a curse upon them all. Thomas and Dawn Song were effectively quarantined. not by the plague, but by prejudice. No one would ride near their ranch. One evening, a frantic pounding echoed at their door. Thomas opened it to find the blacksmith, a burly man named Gus, his face a mask of desperation. His clothes were disheveled, and his eyes were wild with sleeplessness and terror. "Thomas," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe for support. "It's my girl, my little Mary. The doctor. He's done all he can. He says it's in God's hands now." He looked past Thomas, his gaze falling on Dawnsong, who stood by the fire. The blacksmith's face was a war of emotions, fear, hope, and the deep-seated prejudice of his neighbors. "Cain and the others. They say she's a witch. But my wife, she remembers her mother talking about the tribes, about their herb knowledge." He wrung his hat in his hands. "Please, I'm begging you. Is it true? Can she help?" Thomas looked at Dawnsong. This was her decision. To help the people who scorned her was a risk beyond measure. If the child died, they would call her a murderer. They might form a mob. But if she succeeded, Dawnsong's gaze was steady. She looked at the desperate father, and in his eyes, she must have seen the reflection of every parent who had ever feared for their child. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will come," she said. The doctor, Finch, was still at the blacksmith's home, his medical bag open, a look of exhausted defeat on his face. When Thomas and Dawnsong entered the small, stifling room, he looked up with open scorn. "What is this?" he demanded, seeing Dawnsong. "Have you brought this woman into a sick room?" "She's here to help," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Dawnsong ignored the doctor completely. She went to the small bed where a little girl of about 6 lay, her breathing shallow and ragged, her face flushed with a dangerous fever. It was a sound Thomas knew too well. It was the sound of lungs filling with fluid. Dawnsong placed a gentle hand on the girl's forehead, her touch calming. She listened to her breathing, her eyes closing as if she were hearing more than just the struggle for air. She turned to Gus. "I need boiling water, and the plants I brought." She had come prepared, carrying a leather pouch filled with dried roots and leaves from her garden, the one that had once been Sarah's. The doctor scoffed. "This is madness. You'll kill her with your superstitious nonsense." Dawnsong worked with an unhurried, sacred focus. She steeped a bitter-smelling root into a dark tea, forcing a few spoonfuls between the girl's lips. She crushed other leaves, mixing them with hot water to create a fragrant steam, and held the girl's head over the bowl, covering it with a blanket. "Breathe," she murmured to the child, her voice a low, soothing chant. "Breathe the mountain air." Thomas stood guard at the door, his hand resting near the pistol at his hip, his presence a silent warning to the doctor and to any others who might interfere. He was her protector, her shield. For hours, Dawnsong tended to the child, applying poultices to her chest, administering the herbal tea, never resting. Dr. Finch watched with a mixture of contempt and grudging curiosity as his own methods had utterly failed. Towards dawn, a change occurred. The girl's breathing, once so ragged, began to ease. The desperate, rattling sound lessened, replaced by a deeper, clearer rhythm. The fever, which had raged for days, finally broke. By the time the sun crested the mountains, Mary was sleeping peacefully for the first time in a week, a sheen of healthy sweat on her brow. The blacksmith's wife wept with relief, clutching Dawnsong's hand. Gus stood in stunned, grateful silence. Dr. Finch stared at the sleeping child, then at the collection of humble herbs on the table. His scientific certainty shattered. Dawnsong had not used witchcraft. She had used knowledge, knowledge passed down through generations, knowledge of the earth and its power to heal. She had risked everything to save the child of a man who had feared her, and in the quiet dawn of that small room, she had proven that the power of her tradition was stronger than any prejudice. The news of Mary's recovery spread through the valley faster than the sickness had. It was a story told in hushed, awed tones. The Crow woman had done what the doctor couldn't. She had faced the fever and won. The first to arrive was the blacksmith, Gus, his hat in his hand and a freshly baked loaf of bread in the other. He didn't say much, but the gratitude in his eyes was a language Thomas understood perfectly. Then came others. A woman whose husband was sick, a farmer with a child who had the cough. They came not with suspicion, but with a fearful, desperate hope. Jedediah Kane and his cronies tried to stoke the flames of hatred, calling it a fluke, a trick, but their voices were drowned out by the sound of boots walking the path to Thomas's ranch. Dawn's song met each one with the same quiet dignity. With Thomas's help, she turned the barn into a makeshift infirmary, the scent of hay mingling with the sharp, earthy aromas of her remedies. She taught the women which plants to gather, the willow bark for fevers, the mullein for coughs. She showed them how to prepare the poultices and teas. She wasn't just healing their sick, she was sharing her knowledge, planting a seed of understanding in the very community that had tried to cast her out. Thomas became her partner in this endeavor. He chopped wood, hauled water, and stood as a silent, formidable guard against any lingering hostility. He watched her, not just with respect, but with a deep and abiding admiration that had taken root in his heart and grown into something he could only call love. He saw the way she comforted a frightened child, the strength in her hands as she ground herbs, the wisdom in her eyes as she diagnosed an illness. He was no longer just protecting the woman he had saved. He was supporting the woman he loved. As the sickness receded and the valley began to heal, a new sense of purpose settled over the ranch. The fear that had divided the community was slowly being replaced by a shared debt of gratitude. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves on the cottonwoods turned to gold, Thomas found Dawn Song standing on the small hill overlooking the herb garden and the ranch house. The setting sun bathed the valley in a warm, forgiving light. "We saved them," he said, standing beside her. "No," she corrected him gently. "The earth saved them. I only remembered its language." He looked at her, at the strength and peace in her profile, the hollow ache in his chest, the one that had been his constant companion for 12 years, was gone. It had been filled by her presence, by their shared purpose, by the life they had built from the ashes of their pasts. "This house," he said, gesturing to the log cabin. "It was built for a family that's gone. It's full of ghosts." He paused, then took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. It was the first time he had done so, and it felt as natural as breathing. "I think we should build a new house, a new home. Here." He looked at the spot beside them, a place with a clear view of the mountains and the sky. "A home for us, and a place to keep your knowledge safe, a house of healing, for anyone who needs it, to preserve the ways of the crow, so they are not forgotten." Dawn Song looked at him, and for the first time, he saw a brilliant, unreserved smile light up her face. It was like watching the sun break through after a long storm. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a profound, heart-shattering joy. "A home," she whispered, the word full of a meaning she thought had been stolen from her forever. They started the next day, together, with help from a grateful blacksmith and other men from the valley. They felled trees and laid a foundation. They were not just building a structure of wood and stone. They were building a future, a legacy. The widowed rancher who had bought a woman to save her from cruelty and the crow healer who had lost everything had found each other in the heart of the unforgiving West. They had weathered the storms of nature and the hatred of men, and in the end had built more than just a house. They had built a family, a sanctuary, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the simple, sacred act of building a home. The house they built stood for generations, a place known throughout the territories as a sanctuary of healing. It was a bridge between two worlds, built on a foundation of respect and love. The story of the reclusive rancher and the crow healer became a quiet legend, a tale whispered around campfires and told to children on long winter nights. It wasn't a story of grand battles or discovered gold, but of something far more precious, the redemption of two broken souls and the unlikely family they forged. It served as a quiet reminder that a home is not just four walls and a roof, but the safe harbor two people create for each other. It showed that true strength isn't found in a fist or a gun, but in the courage to defend another's honor, to trust in ancient wisdom, and to answer hatred with an open hand. Thomas and Dawn Song's love was a testament to the idea that even in the harshest of landscapes, scarred by prejudice and loss, the most resilient things can grow: compassion, understanding, and a peace that can heal not just a body, but a community. Their legacy wasn't written in history books, but in the lives they saved, the knowledge they preserved, and the simple truth that the deepest wounds can be healed by the quiet, steady work of building a life together.